Coming to you on Friday morning, this is First and Tenn, a Tennessee Titans podcast from the Nashville Post. I'm Post sports reporter Michael Gallagher. Joining me today is our intern, Austin Wright, and a man who kind of helped me get my start in sports journalism. I interned with him back in 2015, took over his job once he left for the better job that he has now. David Boclair, he covers the Tennessee Titans for Sports Illustrated. David, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Michael.
Given where we were last year, I'm sure you're thrilled to actually have some stuff to talk about. Training camp looks a little bit different than it did last year when we didn't really know what was gonna be going on. I think the thing that most fans are interested in this year is just all the different position battles. It feels like there's more competition for different positions this year much more than there were last year. I think tight end, right tackle, corner, kicker, those are at least four positions where we don't know who the starter is right now. And then you have backup quarterback, backup pass rushers, the number 4 receiver. I mean, there's so much competition heading into training camp. So I want to get your guys' take on which position battle. Austin, we kind of touched on this in the last podcast. Which position battle do you think is most intriguing? Which position battle do you think is the most important for the Titans heading into this training camp? David, we'll start with you, and then Austin, you can kind of jump in.
You know, the right tackle, obviously, because of what they've gone through the last couple of years and because of what what you have in terms of the offense with the run game and how important the offensive line is going to be. That's sort of the most important one to me. And it's also the sort of the least dramatic right now. I think Kendall Lamb has that job right now and is going to have to sort of play his way out of it in the preseason in order to not be the starter in week 1. Ty Sambraio's a guy who was signed last year to be the swing tackle, ended up starting 5 games at left tackle. I think they feel really good about him sort of as that swing tackle again. And then, of course, you got the second-round pick in Dillon Radunz, who, is sort of the long-term answer there, but based on what they did with him throughout the OTAs and mini camps, where they worked him at guard on both sides, they worked him at tackle, they're moving him around. To me, that doesn't say this is a guy we're putting on the fast track to be the right tackle. This is a guy they just want to get as much experience as possible. He'll probably do the same thing in the preseason and sort of go into the regular season as a guy that then they want to just have available if they need him. And then the sort of the caveat for Kendall Lamb is don't get hurt, because if you get hurt and you're going to miss 3 games, then they're going to plug Radunz in, and you're not going to get that job back at that point. So that's how I see that one playing out. And then the cornerbacks are really interesting to me because we know who they are. It's just how do they fit together? Jack Rabbit Jenkins is obviously the number 1 guy. Is Christian Fulton a number 2 guy who moves into the slot, or is he strictly an outside guy now with Elijah Molden in the slot? Where does Caleb Farley fit in? Is Caleb Farley going to be able to practice and play right out of the gate? That's the one that's going to be really intriguing to me going into camp.
Yeah, and for me, I would think that the kickers battle is really going to be something to look forward to for the Titans this offseason. With Steven Goskowski, he did all right last season with him nailing 10 of his last 11 kicks for the Tennessee squad. But, I mean, they're really going to have to find someone else for next season because they've had Tucker McCann and Blake Haubeil. I might be saying that wrong. But they've been having them battling it out for this offseason to see who can get that position on track. But for me, I think that's going to be one of the most important parts of this offseason, as the Titans are going to need to find someone that's a little bit more successful and more consistent for the kicking game overall.
Yeah, you can see why they'd like to go cheap at kicker if possible, given all the money they're spending elsewhere on the roster, and obviously they like McCann to a certain degree, having had him on the practice squad or on the team to some degree all of last year. I watched him pretty closely during the couple days of minicamp that we were out there, and he has a real easy sort of low stress kicking style. Like, he's not a guy who sort of marks off every half inch and has to be, exactly right, which I think is a good thing that way. He doesn't look like it's, he has to put everything he has into kicking the ball, but I also didn't see the consistency in his kicks that would make a coach and a general manager sleep well at night. So I'm guessing the Titans' week 1 kicker is not on this roster at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at kicker because who would have thought we would be here after the last 2 years talking about kicker possibly being one of the 2 or 3 most important position battles heading into training camp. But Steven Goskowski, he finished well down the stretch, but he was a dumpster fire last year. And then the year before that, I mean, making only 44% of your kicks as a team, the Titans definitely need to solidify that. And looking at it, Tucker McCann and Blake Howbell, I don't know how you say his name, they're both, if you look at their stats in college, they both struggled with that accuracy like you're talking about, David. And I think that's something that if you go with just the 2 on the roster right now, I would give the slight edge to McCann just because he's been here for the last year. He's been with the team. He's had some work, on the practice squad. But yeah, I think you could be right. I think it's entirely possible we might be looking at the Titans week 1 kicker being a free agent they sign, in training camp. Maybe there's a surprise cut heading into the beginning of the season because both McCann and Hybel, they both struggle with their accuracy. Hybel is almost automatic on extra points, and maybe that plays a little bit into his favor because if you're the Titans, every point you can get is crucial considering how many points you left on the board last year. But I'm not really sold on McCann or Hybel at this point. The one thing they both do have playing into their favor is they both have strong legs. They both have made several kicks of 50 yards or more. McCann had a couple last year, I think, which is why they kept him on the practice squad, is because he was regularly kicking 52, 53 yarders during training camp. But I think that is a battle to watch for. And it could be interesting that they could go with one of them. They could keep both of them, or they could just get rid of both of them and bring in a new, there's literally, we don't know what's going to happen at that position.
Yeah. I just don't see as given what you have on the defense and the fact that, you're probably not going to be, I think you're going to have to win a lot of close games like you did last year. I don't think you can afford to go through growing pains with a kicker during the early part of this season, particularly with the way the schedule is through the first 6 or 7 games. I just don't see John Robinson and Mike Vrabel ultimately saying, you know what, we're okay. I mean, another thing you like about McCann too is that he did some punting in college, and in a pinch, if something happens to Brett Kern, he could do that for you. But I think whether it's Goskowski, whether it's somebody else who gets cut, from another team somewhere, I just think there's going to be a veteran guy in here by week 1, and they're going to have to hope it turns out better than things did in 2019 when they were bringing through a parade of veterans.
Yeah, and I think touching on the cornerbacks too, like you said, David, we know who the guys are. We just don't know where they're going to fit in. Janoris Jenkins right now seems like he's going to be the team's number 1 cornerback, but they took Caleb Farley really high. John Robinson's kind of, he's shown he's not afraid to take a chance on a talented player who should be a top 10, top 15 pick that slides because of injury concerns. The question is, we don't know how healthy Caleb Farley is. And of course, if you ask him, he's going to tell you he's fine, but there was a reason he wasn't on the field during minicamp and during OTAs. You just kind of wonder how far along he is from being able to slide into a full-time role. You have Christian Fulton, who last year, he played well in limited time, but because of injuries and his stint on the COVID list, he didn't play as much as he probably would have liked or the coaches would have liked. And then you have Elijah Molden, Breon Borders, Greg Maben, Quentin Meeks, a list of who's who of journeyman cornerbacks. Just kind of, it's interesting trying to figure out where they slot in, because it makes sense to have Janoris Jenkins and Christian Fulton both on the outside. And then maybe you kind of ease Caleb Farley in and you put Elijah Molden in the slot, because to me, he's the most intriguing person out of that group, because he played 74% of his protection in the slot in college. And I do think he's someone who can be that kind of hybrid safety corner role. Maybe if Amani Hooker struggles, he can slide over and play safety a little bit. But I think Elijah Molden probably will see the field before Caleb Farley does. And I think he could factor in early on and maybe take on a big time role early on for the Titans.
Yeah, and there's questions about Molden's health too. I mean, he was not out on the field during OTAs and mini camps, and everybody was sort of vague about what was going on with him. Mike Vrabel wouldn't even say that he was dealing with an injury. He said something to the effect of, just because a guy's not out there doesn't mean he's hurt. So you don't know what that means. But it will be a young group. Breon Borders, you mentioned, is sort of the I guess the safety net, if you will, a guy who surprised, earned some playing time last year before he got hurt, and a guy who, if nothing else, is going to compete really hard. And he's a guy who sort of gives you a backup sort of at every spot if you need to go that far down the depth chart.
And with Janoris Jenkins being on the team, I think he's going to be able to have a good veteran presence for these younger guys with Caleb Farley and Elijah Molden. But with his quality of play, I mean, Pro Football Focus had him listed down as number 27 on the cornerbacks in the league right now. And I think that might be a little bit too low. And I think that he can have a season that to be able to play outside of those selections so far. And with these young guys, I think he may be able to have a way of showing them a little bit more leadership and trying to build them and mold them a little bit earlier on here this offseason. But there still will be a big battle to decide who the Titans should be able to have as their known starters for this offseason. I think that Caleb Farley could be a good solution for the Titans, but that still remains to be seen with a lot of practice still left to go here in the offseason.
Yeah, the question with Jenkins is he's 32 years old, and you see it with cornerbacks even more so than you do with running backs almost, that there's not a slow decline with those guys. They just fall off the cliff at some point. And, we saw it with Jonathan Joseph last year. That did not work out at all the way the Titans wanted to. The good news is what you've seen from Jenkins during the offseason is a guy who is hyper competitive, a guy who, and when I say that, I mean, like, he's breaking up passes, doing everything he can to break up passes in workouts in May and June, which I haven't seen a lot of from Titans defensive backs over the last couple of years. I've seen a lot of guys running with a receiver, and then as the ball approaches, he pulls up, lets the receiver catch the ball and saying, yeah, okay, I was in position, I would make that play in a game. Or you break on a ball, take a step or two, stop, let the receiver catch the ball, saying, no, I was there. That's not the way Jenkins does it in practice. Jenkins is diving for balls. He's going shoulder to shoulder with receivers, trying to break up passes. And for a pass defense that was, I guess what you can say, struggled, generously speaking, a lot of last year, and is sort of in need of a new identity. I think Jenkins can provide a lot of that through his practice habits, and if he can play, kind of the way he's played throughout most of his career.
Yeah, I think you both raise interesting points, talking about how competitive he is and just the things he does in practice. I do think that that'll be good for the younger guys like a Christian Fulton, a Caleb Farley, Elijah Molden, to see if you're standing there and you're a rookie or you're a first or second year guy and you see this 32-year-old dude running around doing stuff that you're not, that makes you take a long, hard look at yourself and be like, well, if he's 32 and he's been doing this for years, he probably doesn't have that many more years left. If he can do that, why can't I do that? I'm still in my early 20s. I should be able to go and do the things he's doing too. So I think it does set a good example, and it does give that little internal competition too, because none of these young guys you can say probably want to be beaten out by someone like Janoris Jenkins, who's 32. And it's also interesting too that they signed him, because if you're worried about Malcolm Butler, who I think turned 30 or just turned 30 last year, if you're worried about him and his production declining, obviously he was making a lot more money than they're paying Janoris Jenkins. But if you're worried about his production declining and he's a year or two younger than Jenkins, it's curious that you would go out and sign someone like him. But I think to your point, Austin, it does bring in that veteran presence, because if you don't have him, you're looking at Christian Fulton leading a group of rookies and first and second year guys, maybe Breon Borders, probably the oldest guy in that group outside of Janoris Jenkins. So I do think that it's kind of a twofold signing. You bring in that veteran presence to kind of stabilize that group, and you also bring in someone who sets the right example, who sets the bar. This is what you should be doing if you want to win a starting job on this team. And I think one more thing, sorry, I'm trying to pull my notes up here. One more thing I want to talk about as far as the position battles go. The one that I think is the most intriguing to me after I was doing some research for this is the battle for the number 4 wide receiver. It's kind of presumed Julio Jones, A.J. Brown, the top 2. Josh Reynolds will probably be the number 3 guy. But the number 4 receiver job on this team we've heard the Titans coaches are really high on Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for whatever reason. We haven't seen him very often. He played very limited last year. He was kind of relegated to the practice squad for much of the season. They drafted Des Fitzpatrick, who they're also really high on. Cameron Batson played really well in spots last year. Cody Hollister's kind of been around a couple of years. I do think that number 4 receiver job is very much up for grabs. I think Nick Westbrook-Ikhine would probably be the favorite for that job. But from everything that we're hearing from the Titans coaches, Des Fitzpatrick has every chance of taking that job as well.
Yeah, you say Westbrook-Ikhine was on the practice squad, but he's a guy who a lot of times got the game day promotion, ended up playing in every game last year, made some catches, made the catch on the fake punt that Logan Woodside threw to him last year. Actually is a big body, does some of the things they like in the run game in terms of the blocking downfield. But he is an undrafted guy, and he's gonna have to fight for his spot again. You don't trade up 17 spots in the draft to take Des Fitzpatrick and not plan to have him on your roster. I don't think there's any question that Fitzpatrick is in the number 4 spot right now. And then it's a question of Westbrook-Ikhine. It's Cameron Batson. There's 2 veteran guys in Chester Rogers, who has 111 career receptions, Marcus Johnson, who has 42 career receptions. Both of them have played a bunch of games for the Colts over the years, so they're guys that the Titans have seen and know well. They're in the mix too. Johnson, in particular, I think, is a guy who had coaches talking a bit this offseason. Batson is the thing he has going for him is Batson is the primary return man now with Khalif Raymond gone. He's a guy that Mike Vrabel in particular has talked repeatedly over the years about his toughness, that he really likes Cameron Batson's toughness. So I think I think he has the inside spot for a job there, but he sort of is going to have to hold off Mason Kinsey. Mason Kinsey's going to be one of the darlings of the preseason because he's a Division III guy who didn't get a chance to play in any preseason games last year because there were no preseason games. There's no question about his speed. There's no question about his athleticism. But coming from a D3 program, the question is, can he compete and can he make plays against NFL guys who the majority of whom are coming from D1 Power 5 programs? I mean, he's a guy who's going to get a ton of playing time in the preseason and could potentially threaten Cam Batson for that particular spot there at the number 4 or 5, however you want to look at it. So there's a lot of guys there that are going to have to sort themselves out, and it's almost they're sorting themselves out for positions on the depth chart to be the next guy in line when somebody gets hurt, because I think there's just not a lot of snaps, a lot of playing time to go around there with the wide receivers.
And yeah, I would add on to that. That's true. There really is not really much room for error for a lot of these receivers that are on the Titans core. With Marcus Johnson, like you mentioned, David, he could be a favorite to be one of the 4 spots just for the fact that he's been with the Colts. He knows the AFC South. He's already been through that, and he could have a very good also veteran leadership spot to be able to train and mold all the younger guys that are still going to be on the team. With even the 2021 pick, Racey McMath out of LSU, he could be a guy that could be under the spot for the Titans as well, being able to play on their special teams, because that's what he did at LSU as well. So he could also maybe not have to make the receiver crew, but he could find a way onto the special teams spot and make an impact there as well in the offseason. But just some of those guys like Marcus Johnson would be interesting to look at since he's already had experience, and Westbrook-Ikhine, he could be, like you said, a valuable asset just for the fact that he's been a very versatile receiver and could be one of the better acquisitions for the Titans this offseason.
Yeah, McMath, he has a leg up because he's a draft pick, right? They don't draft you with the idea, well, we'll take a look at him, and if we don't like him, we'll cut him. I mean, there's something you really like about him. You want him on the team. But I don't think, to your point, Austin, he's not competing for a wide receiver spot this year. He's competing with the fifth or sixth linebacker and the fifth or sixth defensive back or whatever, for a special team spot. He's going to sort of have to make his way into the NFL the same way he did at LSU, which is play special teams and grow from there. And he doesn't have big stats as a receiver, but last year he was playing a lot of receiver early in the year before a hamstring injury sidelined him and sort of cut short his season. So he's, I'll say this: he's a big body, and what I've seen from him, I have questions about his footwork. If he's ever gonna have quick enough feet to get in and out of routes in the NFL and do that sort of thing. But that if he's going to buy himself time to do that and grow into that role, it's going to have to be as a special teams guy, and he certainly has the background and the build to be able to compete in that way.
Yeah, I mean, when you get down to it, you're really talking about 7 or 8 solid wide receivers competing for probably what I would think is going to be maybe 5 spots. I don't foresee the Titans carrying 6 or 7 receivers. I think you got 7 or 8 guys fighting for 5 spots. And maybe someone like a Racey McMath, who has the speed and has the special teams ability that he does, maybe he takes one of those spots away from someone else. Maybe Cody Hollister goes back to the practice squad. Maybe Nick Westbrook-Akeen ends up going back to the practice squad. There's a lot of competition for those spots behind Julio Jones, AJ Brown, and I do think that's going to be probably one of the fiercest competitions to watch outside of maybe right tackle or the cornerback group. Kind of going. Oh, go ahead.
It's going to make the backup quarterback battle in the preseason really interesting too, because both DeShone Kizer and Logan Woodside are going to get plenty of playing time, and they're going to have guys with some experience. They're not going to be throwing to just a bunch of undrafted rookies when they're in the game. Neither one of them. They're going to be throwing to guys who have played in this league or have been around this league to some degree and have made varying degrees of plays. So I think what you'll see is Woodside and Kizer both have a chance to sort of put their best foot forward, regardless of who plays first in which game and whatnot. I think they'll both have receivers who, for the most part, will have matchup advantages when they're on the field, and will be open, and it'll be just up to the quarterbacks to find them and show they're making the right reads and can make the right throws.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into the next topic we want to talk about is who exactly has the inside track for the backup quarterback job. DeShone Kizer, Logan Woodside, both of them haven't really found their footing in the NFL. But DeShone Kizer, Logan Woodside's been here for a couple of years. He hasn't really done much. I mean, he hasn't really had a lot to compete with too. Trevor Siemian and Cole McDonald didn't really put up much of a fight when he was competing with them. Cole McDonald was cut very early on after being drafted. But if you look at DeShone Kizer, he was Tennessee's quarantine quarterback last year. He was brought in kind of as the emergency guy in case something happened. He worked exclusively with quarterbacks coach Pat O'Hara. And I think that I'm leaning towards Kizer over Woodside for the fact, one, Kizer has starting experience in the NFL. Granted, it was with the Cleveland Browns and he wasn't very good, but he does have that experience. And two, he spent most of his year working exclusively with Pat O'Hara. I think he has a good grasp of the system, and I think he plays very similarly to the way Ryan Tannehill plays. And I think that he kind of fits the Titans' offensive system better than Logan Woodside does. And kind of looking at OTAs and minicamp, it was a very small sample size, but he had a touchdown pass, I think, to Briley Moore, where he kind of squeezed it in a tight window. He had another one to Mason Kinsey where he kind of floated it over his shoulder in the corner of the end zone. I do think he's shown an ability to fit the ball in the tight windows, and he can also finesse some passes if he needs to. So that's why I would kind of I lean more towards Kizer than Woodside, simply because I feel like Kizer's just a better fit. What do you guys think?
Kizer, I can't get past the fact that Kizer's 0-15 as a starting quarterback in this league. I can't get past the fact that he's a second-round pick who hasn't played in a regular season game since 2018. I mean, a guy like that should be getting his opportunities somewhere. That being said, watching him in minicamp, he has a better arm than I expected him to have, or than it looked like having watched him on TV over in the times that he did play. I think it could be a situation where they sort of set it up like they did last year, where you have one of them on the active roster, one on the practice squad. That one on the active roster could be Woodside, where, it could be Kaiser, where if something happens to Tannehill, he gets you through a game. But they might like to see Woodside if it's sort of a long-term injury, and because they have invested in him, they in terms of time and confidence, and they still express confidence in him. But I think going into camp, Woodside is number 2, but he's going to have to, for the first time, much more so than was the case last year. I mean, he's going to have to hold on to that job and show that he really deserves to be there this year.
And I agree. I think DeShone Kizer would be a better fit for the Titans overall. He is a little bit more mobile of a quarterback, and that could fit very well with playing in kind of any option schemes that they might want to run with Derrick Henry, and his ability to maybe get out of the pocket and have to throw anything that he would need to say Julio Jones, if he would need to in a game outside of the pocket. That might be a great option because he might be a little bit better and more adept at doing that than, say, Logan Woodside. But I think that they should keep DeShone Kizer on the active roster and possibly, like you said, David, keep Logan Woodside on like a practice squad type of role, and probably just try and manipulate any situations that they can and in the preseason to find any positive outcomes with what kind of schemes might work best for DeShone Kizer, which might be a little bit more of a mobile situation.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect, again, I would expect Tannehill to throw maybe 20 passes max in the 3 preseason games. In fact, that might even be a big number. And then, they're just going to let these these other 2 guys play it out and see who's who. They're they both have their virtues. Like I said, I can't get past the fact that Kaiser's 0-15 as a starter, but I also can't get past the fact that Woodside has thrown 3 passes in regular season games in his career, and the only one he's completed was a fake punt. So, but in order to get experience, you have to get experience. At some point they're going to have to play you. And I think back to a guy like Billy Volek, who was a 3rd-string quarterback for 3 years for the Titans, and eventually got his opportunity. What was it, in 2003 or so, and put up some big numbers and ended up hanging around the league for a long time. So you can see the path for a guy like Logan Woodside and how he would get there, but he does have a much more serious challenge for that number 2 job right now than he did at this time a year ago.
That's kind of the beauty of having an actual preseason this year as opposed to last year when there was nothing. None of the younger guys had a chance to really get that live game feel, kind of have some game tape if they were cut to go show another team, like, this is what I can do. And I do think it's going to be very important having 3 full games. Like you said, Tannehill maybe will have 20 pass attempts in those 3 games. To have 3 full games of actual competition between Kizer and Woodside to kind of figure out who is going to be that guy. And I do think that it's something that Mike Vrabel probably, he'll never admit it, but I think it's something that he's really excited about. And I do think it'll benefit the wide receivers as well. You're looking at trying to find your number 4, your number 5 wide receivers. It's also going to be beneficial to find out who your number 2 and your number 3 quarterbacks are. And I think kind of leading into the next topic here is the preseason is obviously very big. So is training camp. So kind of taking all that into account, quick hits here. Who do you guys feel has the most to gain from training camp in the preseason, and who has the most to lose from training camp in the preseason? My pick for the most to gain, I would say, is Dylan Radins, for a lot of the reasons you mentioned earlier, David. I think the strength of his game is his run blocking ability, and that's, the Titans are a run heavy team. He kind of fits the mold of what they're looking for in that aspect, but his pass protection is a big question mark. He only played on 215 passing downs at North Dakota State. Kendall Lamb graded as a better run blocker last year than a pass protector too. But I do think for the fact that Kendall Lamb's 29, he's already going into his 7th year. He is who he's going to be. Radins is still younger. He's still a little bit more coachable. And I think he could possibly beat out Kendall Lamb for that job. Maybe not heading into week 1, but I think he could show enough that they pull the plug quickly on Lamb if he struggles going into the season. And I think the guy who can play himself out of a job would be Kendall Lamb as well. But my pick is going to be Rashaan Evans, just because John Robinson declined the 5th-year option on him. They already drafted Monty Rice. They have David Long Jr. They have Jayon Brown, who I think they want to bring back and sign to more than just a 1-year deal. I think they have his kind of replacements lined up. Rashaan Evans had a really good 2019, but I think he's kind of played himself out of favor last year. And so I think that's who I would say maybe he'll be the starter heading into the season, but I think it wouldn't take much for David Long to kind of pass him up for that second inside linebacker job.
I like the guy that I'm going to go down the roster a little bit in terms of a guy that really has a lot to gain. But you mentioned it sort of at the top, Michael, and we haven't gotten into it. But the tight end group is really an inexperienced bunch, and you've got Anthony Firkser, you've got Jeff Swaim, but you lost Jonnu Smith, you lost Michael Pruitt, you really haven't replaced those two guys, right? So there's all 4 of those guys played in various roles last year, and the guy who's sort of there's been a lot of talk about the guy out of Vanderbilt, Jared Pinkney, but the guy to me you really need to keep an eye on there is Tommy Hudson, an undrafted free agent out of Arizona State last year. He's 6'3", 255. He only caught like 25 passes during his college career. He's a classic sort of end of the line run blocking tight end, and we know what this Titans offense is, and the Titans clearly liked him enough to keep him around all last season, even though he served a suspension for violation of the league's performance-enhancing drugs policy. He had he spent time on the COVID list, but he was around all season. They brought him back this year. They clearly want to see something from him. I mean, he's a guy who could not only earn a roster spot, but could be a guy who's on the field a lot on first and second down, blocking for Derrick Henry when we get into the regular season. So he's a guy that I think I think has as big an opportunity as anybody on this roster. And the guy who I think could find himself in a little bit of trouble is Dane Crookshank, who's going into his 4th year, a guy they drafted a few years ago. He's been really useful as sort of that sometimes safety, sometimes cornerback, sometimes linebacker kind of guy. Missed virtually all of last season with an injury, and while he was out, they drafted Chris Jackson in the 7th round last year. Jackson is sort of the same sort of guy he is that Crookshank is, only now a little bit younger, a little bit cheaper. As we talked about all the cornerbacks earlier, I don't know that Jackson figures into that into that picture in terms of competing for an every down outside classic cornerback kind of guy, but in terms of your Swiss Army knife, a guy who can sort of move around, fill in spots. I think that's what they envisioned when they drafted Jackson last year, and I think it might be sort of a competition between Jackson and Crookshank for one spot on the roster, and given the severity of Crookshank's hamstring injury last year, I think he's the guy who's really going to have to prove himself once again.
And for me, one of the biggest guys that will have a big impact for this offseason and that could have the most to gain would be Des Fitzpatrick. I think that he could probably have one of the biggest upsides for the Titans, just in the fact that he is very young, but that also means that he could have the biggest downside, that being the fact that he would have a lot of inexperience and need to have a lot of coaching to do, and being able to get on this roster, figure out the schemes, and be able to compete with a lot of guys. Like we mentioned earlier, that this is a very crowded group, but he could have a very outstanding offseason and find a way to make that 4th wide receiver spot for them alongside AJ Brown, Julio, and Josh Reynolds. And with that, that also does mean that with those other guys still remaining on the roster that are going to be fighting for a spot, like Cameron Batson and Marcus Johnson, that could mean that he could also have the biggest downside, just for the fact that he's got all those guys behind him, and he's going to have to compete and find a way to get onto the roster as soon as he can and make an impact as fast as possible.
All right, we got about 3.5 minutes before Zoom kicks us off here because we're on the time limit thing here. But real quick, I want to finish up with Delanie Walker. Last week made some headlines saying Anthony Firkser has the potential to be elite. Do we agree with that, or do we not agree with that? David, we'll start with you.
I do not agree with it. I mean, Anthony Firkser has earned his opportunity this year. He's a guy who has the trust of his quarterback. He will get favorable matchups. Like, no pass defense is going to be lining up looking at the Titans saying, we got to have our best guy on Anthony Firkser. So he'll have matchups he can win. But you know, when you're talking about elite tight ends in this league, you're talking about Travis Kelce, you're talking about, you know, Kittle in San Francisco, you're talking about Zach Ertz. I don't see Firkser in that group, and I don't see him having the opportunity to put up those kind of numbers.
And yeah, I'm kind of with you as well, David. I don't believe that Anthony Firkser is of the elite category right now. He does have a lot of room to improve, but again, like we mentioned earlier, this is still a very crowded wide receiver group. You've got Derrick Henry as well. So the Titans are loaded on offense already, and it's just going to be hard to try and pass the ball around. It's kind of like an NBA situation where everybody's going to want the ball all at the same time and trying to find as many scoring opportunities as possible. So I think it'll be a little bit more difficult for him to be one of the main targets for Ryan Tannehill. So I don't believe that he could be an elite receiver just for the fact that he may not get quite as much attention. But I do think that he has the talent to keep the Titans afloat on offense and be a good safety net option for them every time that they get down the field. And I do think that he has proven his abilities of being a good tight end, but I don't think elite.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I don't think he's elite. I do think he could be solid to good. He only had he dropped 1.9% of his passes. I think he's a good safety net for Ryan Tannehill, but I don't think that he's going to be elite. That'll wrap it up for today. David, thank you for joining me. Austin, thank you as well. You can find him on Twitter at Boclair Sports, on Sports Illustrated. I think it's alltitans.com, right?
Alltitans.com. It's just si.com/NFL/Titans.
There you go. You can find him there, and you can find Austin and work for myself on the Nashville Post. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Always a great time.